Good morning, afternoon, or evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first of many grammar mechanics, usage and grammar videos with Mr. Costello's class. As I'm sure we've already discussed in class, and hopefully you picked up and paid attention, the way these work is that there is a slideshow that I've made here that discusses quite thoroughly one of the standards of focus for us. As we move through this lesson, the video will stop at periods to check your understanding. It will ask quick questions to make sure you're understanding what exactly it is that the lesson is trying to teach you. And at the very end, we'll have a little quiz of ACT-style questions to make sure we're fully operational when it comes to knowing this stuff and having mastered these standards. Okay, so with no further ado, we start with appropriate apostrophes. Gotta love the alliteration. So, we're going to look at how to use apostrophes to correctly show possession. Apostrophes can also be used for something else, but we'll look at that later. Specifically, this is ACT's standard punctuation 402 in the English standard list for ACTs, so you can absolutely trust me that this is a valuable ACT skill. So let's get into it. The apostrophe. This piece of punctuation can show possession and combine words into contractions. Now, don't worry if you're among my students who previously has had trouble with apostrophes. You are not alone. But after this lesson, I'm pretty sure you're going to have mastered at least the possession application of apostrophes. So it's all good. Don't worry. First, let's make sure we don't mix up two bits of punctuation. Yeah, believe it or not, this does happen sometimes. Nothing to be ashamed of, but let's get accurate. So on the left here, although this is a bit blurry, we have the comma. On the right, we have the apostrophe. Notice how they are essentially identical, save for one important detail, and that's where they appear on the line. So the comma comes down low. We actually have an example right here. The apostrophe comes up high. There's an example right there. Now, this is not a big deal, but in previous years, I have had students kind of struggle to get over the hump of calling an apostrophe as opposed to a comma. And we're all smart in here, or at least we're going to get there. And I want us to sound as smart as we are. And referring to an apostrophe as a comma is probably not an apocalyptic mistake, but it does sound a bit amateur hour. And we don't want to do that. So the apostrophe comes up top, unlike his twin brother, the comma, which comes down low. All right, using apostrophes to mark singular possession. So how do we do this? Now, first off, we need to look at a part of speech, the noun. Now, nouns include people, places, things, and ideas. Things that don't have a physical form like courage or fear would fall under that ideas section. And what we mean by that is that they're abstract. You can't actually touch your courage, so to speak, but they're still under the umbrella of nouns technically. So we would still call that a noun. Okay, so nouns can be singular or plural. Singular means just one. So example, one single dog. Plural means more than one. For example, multiple dogs. See here we have pluralized D-O-G-S. So one dog, multiple dogs, singular, plural. Okay. Typically you pluralize nouns by adding an S, but sometimes you have what are called irregular nouns, which will behave a little differently when pluralized. As you can see here, the singular forms child, man, goose, and thesis are all examples of irregular nouns because when pluralized, you don't simply add an S or an ES. You go children, men, geese, and theses. Not to be confused with feces, because if your thesis is feces, well, it's not good, we'll say. One more quick note. Never, ever, 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 ever use an apostrophe simply to make a noun plural. If you're making a noun plural, you add an S, as we see here with our regular nouns, or you use whatever unique irregular noun pluralization, it'll be different for pretty much every word. But you never use an apostrophe just to make something plural. This is a really common mistake among sort of developing English writers and users, is that they'll use that apostrophe just to pluralize. We want to really get that habit out, because you'll never use an apostrophe simply to pluralize a noun. All right, so let's move on. Nouns can also be possessive, which means that a particular noun owns something. Now, to do this with a singular noun, this is as simple as adding apostrophe S. All right, so nouns can be possessive. Sorry for the brief interruption. Now, to do this with a singular noun, we just add an apostrophe S. So when these nouns own something, just an apostrophe S indicates that ownership. So, for example, Mr. Costello, quote unquote, owns his coffee. So it's Mr. Costello's coffee. You see that right there? We've added that apostrophe S to the singular noun, Mr. Costello, to indicate it's going to be in possession of something. In this case, coffee. Do me a favor, don't get this pretty simple principle wrong. Otherwise, Mr. Costello's coffee will no longer be in Mr. Costello. So let's add a tiny wrinkle to this. Even when you have a singular noun that ends in S, you still apply a simple apostrophe S. Now, admittedly, this is going to be something that even my advanced students might be not 100% confident on. But for simplicity's sake, the most common grammar rule that's accepted in adding possession to a singular noun is, if it ends in S, is still to add that apostrophe S. It may feel a little awkward at first, but it's still the best route to go. So, for example, James, quote unquote, owns his Takis, so they are James's Takis. Now, I know that S apostrophe S is a little awkward at the end of a word that you see right there, but that's actually the right route to go. I would argue, though, whether or not Takis are the right route to go, because they are gross. All right, so a quick review of what we've looked at so far. Using apostrophes to mark singular possession with a singular noun that's just simple. To make all singular nouns possessive, all you have to do is add an apostrophe and an S at the end of that singular noun. This is still true if that singular noun ends in S, like our friend James from the last slide. Do the same thing when that singular noun ends in S. This rule is actually simpler than a lot of people make it. Just use the same singular possession the whole way through. How about plural possession? So we said that nouns can be singular or plural, right? And we know that an apostrophe S will mark possession for a singular noun. What about plural, though? Well, there's a bit of a new way. So when a noun is plural, typically that noun will end in S. Now, we'll talk about irregular plural nouns such as children, you remember from a couple slides ago, later, because those have their own possession rules. How do we handle these standard regular nouns when pluralized, though, to make them possessive? Simply, we add an apostrophe to the end of the plural noun. So if you give your singular dog a bone, that becomes the dog's bone. You see the singular apostrophe application being done there in that example. If you have multiple dogs, and by the way, I'm here to tell you that the more dogs, the merrier, you have to apply plural possession to dogs now instead of that singular possession. So you give all of your dog's bones, that becomes the dog's bones with an S apostrophe at the end, like what you see right here. So that's the rule for whenever you have a plural noun and you want to make that plural noun possessive. Multiple dogs having multiple bones. Let's take one more closer look at this just to make sure that we've got it under our feet. Let's pretend that you're at the movie theater with a bunch of friends and you're going to buy their tickets. Now, once you do that, they own their tickets. So how do we indicate that? Remember, we're looking at the plural noun friends here, and we're going to try to make that possessive. Think about it. Here we go. At the movie theater, I bought my friends tickets. All right. Your friends are in possession of these tickets. So notice how we've taken this plural noun friends and added just an apostrophe at the end of the S here to mark this plural possession. And there's our arrow pointing at that apostrophe to let you know how it goes. So what we've done is we take the plural friends and we want to make that plural noun friends possessive. We simply add an apostrophe after that final S. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. On a side note, if you're buying all your friends' tickets, good news. Goodness, you're certainly more loaded than I am. So let's throw another wrinkle into things. Let's look at using apostrophes to make plural irregular nouns possessive. Plural irregular nouns possessive. I just want to note, that's a really smart sentence right there. Y'all just sound like you belong in the office of a really expensive mansion, sitting in a nice upholstered chair, smoking a bubble pipe. Sorry. Apostrophes and plural irregular nouns. So, okay, earlier we discussed these things called irregular nouns. Now, if you recall, irregular nouns are ones that pluralize uniquely. And what I mean by that is when they become plural, it's a little bit more complicated than just adding an S. Okay, back to it. So, if we have one of these examples where child becomes children, these irregular plural nouns, there's a new possession rule or a different possession rule for these. So how do we make these nouns possessive? In most cases, we just add an apostrophe S as if it were a singular noun. So remember apostrophe S being the rule to make a singular noun possessive? When we have these irregular nouns, we actually, when they're pluralized, we actually apply that same principle. So if the children have lunches, those become the children's lunches. That's how we would mark children as possessive, just a good old-fashioned apostrophe S afterward. So when we have most irregular nouns, when we pluralize them, that's how they become irregular, because they don't just add S or ES. If we want to make those plural irregular nouns possessive, we actually just apply the singular regular noun possession rule. So an apostrophe S that you see right here. Okay? I apologize, but I'm going to add one more wrinkle to this. Some irregular nouns still end in S when they're pluralized. For example, knife changes to knives and leaf changes to leaves. Now, even though they end in S, they're still called irregular nouns because notice how it's changed in its plural form. That knife becomes knives, and that leaf becomes leaves. That F to V change indicates to us that there is a shift in how it's written when it's pluralized. English is really fun like that. So how do we make these nouns possessive? These irregular nouns that when they pluralize, they still end in S. Well, since they end in S, let's just treat them like regular nouns that are pluralized. He polished his knives' blades. So we have the plural form of knife here, which we have already said is an irregular noun. But since it's one of these irregular nouns that ends in S, we'll treat it like a standard regular plural possessive, and we'll just add the apostrophe after the S. All right? So there's a differentiation there that's important to make. With most irregular nouns, child to children, man to men, woman to women, we would just add apostrophe S at the end of that. However, sometimes you'll have these irregular nouns that when pluralized, it's not so much the S that shifts, it's other parts of the word, such as knife to knives or leaf to leaves. We'll actually apply the plural possession rule from regular nouns to those irregular nouns, just like we would otherwise, right? Just to make it nice and simple. And I know that's a sword, but it's the best I can do. Bitmoji doesn't have a whole lot of sharpening knives pictures. So there you go. So let's review. Appropriate apostrophes. With singular possession, to make that singular or noun possessive, we simply add an apostrophe and an S. This is still true when a singular noun ends in S. For example, James becomes James's when made possessive. You see it right there. With plural possession, if we want to make a noun plural, we typically add S to pluralize or ES unless it's an irregular noun. Now, with these regular nouns, when we add that S or ES to make those possessive, it's actually pretty simple. We just add the apostrophe after the S that comes at the end of that plural noun. For example, dogs becomes dogs, D-O-G-S apostrophe when made possessive. Finally, with irregular possession, when we're making a plural irregular noun possessive, we need to add an apostrophe and S if that plural irregular noun doesn't end in S. For example, children's, children apostrophe S. But if that irregular plural noun ends in S, we need to add only an apostrophe after that S. For example, knives, if we want to make that plural. One last section here, folks. A note on its versus its, etc. So this part of the apostrophe rule is a bit unfair. I'll put it simply. It's with an apostrophe, I-T apostrophe S, this guy right here, means it is, while it's with no apostrophe is actually the possessive form of it. For example, I can't wear that dress because its buttons tore off. Notice how we don't have an apostrophe right here. Now, I know apostrophe S is so often what we use to make things possessive, or at least the use of some form of an apostrophe somewhere. But with this particular word, it's different. I know it's a bit unfair, but for what it's worth, it's a pretty limited amount of words where it works this way. But it might help to think of it this way. It, you, and they all work the same way, all of those pronouns. The possessive form of each lacks an apostrophe. So it, to make that possessive, goes ITS, no apostrophe. You becomes YOUR with no apostrophe. You'll get dunked on social media if you get that wrong. #your. And they goes to THEIR to make it possessive. Notice how none of those have apostrophes in them. In each case, the contraction form of those will actually have an apostrophe, but we'll get to contractions in a later lesson. Ladies and gentlemen, nice work. If you have any questions at all, I'm roaming the room as you go over this and hopefully have the entire time. You can always ask during those sessions. You can email me at rgcostello@enidk12.org, or you can visit me during office hours. That's Monday, Tuesday, or Friday at 8 a.m., and I do afternoons by appointments as well. Thanks for sitting with me, ladies and gentlemen. I hope this was an illuminating lesson, and let's get on to the rest of class.